Thank you, everybody, for being here today. If I'm honest, I still feel like the invite was a bit of a mistake, bit of cross wires. I've seen some of the very illustrious speakers that have been on the list who've spoken to you already, and my inclusion feels a bit incongruous. It feels like a bit like you've been used to eating at Noma or Alchemist, and I'm a dishevelled cafe in a run-down railway station. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak, and to Gareth and the DS team for not cancelling. Right, so now that I've warmed you up with my ability to Google famous Danish restaurants, I'll turn to the talk. So as this word cloud suggests, I'm going to talk a bit about interdisciplinarity, its current political currency, its challenges, and the types of temporal and affective management that can foster interdisciplinary work and collaboration. So I won't be presenting, as Gareth has said, on any ongoing research or project findings, but instead taking interdisciplinarity as my object. To do so, in the second half of my talk, I will draw in part upon experiences on a long-running interdisciplinary research project called Waiting Times, and within a transdisciplinary research institute, the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health, that's based at the University of Exeter. Before starting, though, I thought it might be worth providing a bit of context on these sites of collaboration. The most important thing to say, as the title indicates, my experiences relate primarily to humanities, arts and social sciences, or HAS collaborations. So much of the literature that I've seen on multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary working tends to focus on collaborations across STEM and colleagues in what we might loosely call clinical and STEM sciences, so sciences, technology, engineering and maths. And here the asymmetries of power, prestige and resource tend to be more acute, and the epistemic gaps between different disciplines tend to be wider. To quote Felicity Callard and Des Fitzgerald's wonderful book, these collaborations are often, to quote, of a more fractious kind of interdisciplinarity. By contrast, both the Waiting Times project and the Wellcome Centre are marked by less clear divergences. Waiting Times is a project which explores lived experiences, representations and histories of impeded and delayed time to consider what it means to wait in and for healthcare. It's led by Lisa Breitzer, who's a professor of psychosocial theory at Birkbeck, and Laura Salisbury, who's professor of modern literature and medical humanities at the University of Exeter. The wider team, moreover, comprises creative and performance artists, critical theorists, ethnographic social scientists, literary scholars, psychoanalytic psychotherapists, a semiotician and historians. Similarly, the Wellcome Centre has around, I think, 50 members and 20 affiliates from a range of humanities and social science backgrounds. And they include anthropologists, creative practitioners, cultural studies scholars, geographers, historians, literary scholars, philosophers, psychologists and sociologists, among others, all from a range of different schools and approaches. The Centre supports a wide range of research culture programmes to foster collaboration, but it also houses projects that use interdisciplinary and engaged research methodologies to explore the cultural framing of medical knowledge and experiences of health and illness. So where these two sort of settings differ then, and this is something that I will return back to later, is in their function as sites of collaboration. So Waiting Times has different strands of research, but it's more tightly focused on this shared object of waiting and health, whereas the Wellcome Centre operates more as a hub and an environment for emergent collaborations. Now, despite appearing more closely related in epistemic terms, working with scholars from different interpretive disciplines still produces opportunities for misunderstandings, tensions, and for transformative work. But I want to flag this up as a way of apology for people who are in clinical and STEM subjects, should much of what I say not translate too well. I hope there will be some issues that are shared and that we can draw out, but if not, it would be really interesting to hear from you as to why you think that there may be differences between the types of collaboration in your experience. The second and I think more obvious thing to say is that I'm also talking about experiences in a very specific context, which is British academia roughly over the last 10 years. I'll draw out the importance of this later on, but I flag it because, again, much of what I say may not translate across contexts, even within global North academies that have shared similar structural and political reforms over the past 30 years. Okay, so the shape of the session. I'll begin by outlining what I mean by interdisciplinary working, and then I'll move on to contextualize both waiting times and the Welcome Centre in a broader historical and institutional context. Throughout, I will make references to a broader literature, partly to provincialize my own readings of this situation as a reading, and partly to acknowledge the vast scholarship on interdisciplinarity that already exists. After this, in the second part of the talk, I'll briefly reflect on my own work and how that has transformed through my collaborations as a way to underline the transformative effects that interdisciplinarity can have. I'll then draw out some of the challenges, particularly affective and logistic, that can arise from bringing together scholars from different disciplines, and from the particular conjunctions of funding, labour and institutional expectations that have supported British interdisciplinary work. And then I'll conclude with a short consideration of how these challenges have been met within the settings that I'm familiar with. After a very short break, I think then we can move into a broader discussion, if there's time, about, as a group, about your own experiences in this type of work. I'll be very happy to answer questions if there are any, but I thought, given that we've got such a vast range of expertise in the room, it might be interesting to have something slightly more dialogic if there's opportunity. Okay. So what do I mean by interdisciplinary working? Well, if I turn to the second part of the phrase first, I use the term working to emphasize the different types of labour that enable interdisciplinarity to function, particularly organisational and administrative work. In terms of interdisciplinarity itself, within the broader literature, it seems that there's not a massive consensus over what this means. Indeed, interdisciplinarity has become the subject of a considerable range of a considerable academic industry in the past 2 decades in particular, the source of articles, edited collections, handbooks, monographs, and collectively written volumes. Academics have, moreover, done more than just contest definitions. They've debated the politics and origins of interdisciplinarity, its justifications, its desirability, and they've exalted and worried about its intellectual and social consequences, some of which, again, I'll pick up on shortly. However, adapting some of the more simplified and pragmatic open-ended definitions, I would describe the interdisciplinarity I'm familiar with in something like the following. It's the exchange between and collaboration of scholars from different disciplinary backgrounds, conducted with the aim of transforming thinking and practices on a particular subject or set of problems. This is often contrasted with multidisciplinarity, in which, according to Callard and Fitzgerald, to quote, disciplines line up alongside one another, end quote, that it will be in collaboration, but it's often not seeking to change the usual disciplinary concepts and practices that people are familiar with. However, borrowing from Mitchell Ash and Michel Lamont, it's also worth acknowledging that diverse definitions for interdisciplinarity exist, to quote, due to the obvious, yet perhaps not entirely banal fact that interdisciplinarity has many manifestations. And we should point out that disciplines are themselves mutable historical constructs. They are, in Ash's terms, moving targets, or what we might see as contingent formations of expertise that vary across contexts, institutionalized for the purposes of education and research. Some have, of course, proven more stable than others, but nonetheless, disciplines interrelate and they cross-fertilize with one another in their development, and their aims and contents change in relation to social and political movements, policy imperatives, relationships with institutions of state and biopolitical governance, among other innumerable factors. And the same can be said for what Harvey Graff and others have called interdisciplines, or new formations emerging through disciplinary crossings. And again, it extends to interdisciplinary sites, exchanges, and projects. In other words, then, we should note that different notions, definitions, and practices of interdisciplinarity, and thus experiences of interdisciplinary working, get constructed in different ways in different times and places. And again, these are shaped by particular historical conjunctions of actors, organizations, materials, technologies, funding, and political and institutional landscapes. Okay. So how might we apply this to the British context? Well, although many scholars accept that interdisciplinarity in the Western academy has long and diverse histories, they also roughly agree that the political, economic and institutional frameworks for interdisciplinarity have shifted across the later 20th century. Or, put more bluntly, that drives for interdisciplinary research have, at least in part, been structured by neoliberal political economies and new imperatives of global capital. Discursively, as Barry and Bourne put it, this manifests in calls for flexibility, accountability, and, to quote, the capacity of interdisciplinary research to assist in forging closer relations between scientific research and the requirements of the economy through fostering innovation. And according to Marian Aguiar, in US South Asian studies, this has realigned the interdisciplinary goals from previous emphases on socio-historical problems of communities, on anti-colonial and decolonial work, and critical epistemologies, towards, in her words, to quote, the integration of students and research into forms of instrumental knowledge that marks the processes of market expansion. Moreover, she adds that business demands, and to quote, the focus on innovation rather than reflective, critical or slow thinking has created a more just-in-time approach to knowledge. Now, I would agree here with the broad point that the political foundations for contemporary interdisciplinarity are structured through neoliberal economics and reforms of higher education. So on the one hand, the same policy discourse around interdisciplinarity exists in the UK as elsewhere. That is that interdisciplinarity is the only way to tackle the so-called big questions in an innovative way, and that instrumental logics and forms of accountability should be attached to certain forms of funding. And on the other, as I'll return to later, universities' orientation to research funding and workloads have been structured, in turn, by policies to marketize higher education. Put briefly, new fiscal imperatives, the removal of student cap numbers, and shifting costs onto consumers of education have been transformative. They've created new forms of demanding labour, created an environment of precarious working, and assigned large portions of institutional income to quote-unquote high-impact research, which often needs to be interdisciplinary to attract funding. At the same time, however, I would also note there have been bottom-up pulls towards interdisciplinary collaboration, and there have also been countervailing pressures within the UK that have shaped the types of interdisciplinary collaborations taking place. So firstly, in contradiction to the literature, neither the origins of nor the formations of nor the forms of working within waiting times or the Welcome Centre have resembled institutional impositions or top-down state imperatives. At least from the inside, motivations for collaboration have generally reflected the epistemic, affective, and social and personal opportunities and rewards that this interdisciplinary working and exchange can offer. There has been a genuine shared belief from all parties that understanding, for instance, waiting or health and well-being in all their complexities will benefit from collaboration across disciplines and the transformations in thinking that can result from that. This is something, and this is the images on the side, suggest this is something that we hope has been manifested externally, particularly in jointly produced collections and new concepts through which to think through waiting and engaged health research. Secondly, I should note that my particular experiences of interdisciplinarity have been shaped by the influence of the Wellcome Trust on British HAS and medical science research. So I'm not sure how familiar you are, but the Trust is a UK-based global charitable foundation, and it has a stated mission to improve health through support to a broad spectrum of research and education. Like everything in Britain, it's got colonial roots, and the Wellcome Trust has a history rooted in pharma. But unlike a lot of institutions, it has also acknowledged this history and has sought to respond to it. The Trust has provided considerable support to medical humanities and social science research, and it's also been a source of funding for the centre in which I did my PhD, as well as my postdoctoral work, the Waiting Times Project, and the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. Though its streams for funding have shifted considerably over the time that I've been in academia, by contrast to neoliberal instrumentalism, its calls have always been open and its understandings of impact have always been diverse. They relate broadly to scholarship, public education and engagement, new methodologies and approaches, rather than a reductively economic or strategic political aim. And though a core part of the landscape in which drives for external funding and precarity have been shaped, it has also tended to provide long-term grants, with waiting times now running into its 6th year and the centre scheduled to run for 7. The Trust has, in other words, been central to the formation of whole fields and different types of collaboration, and it's worked against the temporal and instrumentalised effects of broader political change that other people have noted in different contexts. Okay, so how has working in these collaborations been transformative? Though much of the literature on interdisciplinarity stresses transformations for fields and for approaches, I'm going to focus much more tightly on my own work. Partly this is because I don't feel legitimately able to make pronouncements on anybody else's behalf or to speak on behalf of a whole field. But I think it's also because the work we've been doing has been vast and its impact is still in the process of unfolding, and a kind of a reasonable assessment may well be some years away. For myself, though, the impact of waiting times and the Wellcome Centre has been most profound in 2 ways. Firstly, and in some ways most obviously, discussions with colleagues across HAS disciplines has opened up whole new sets of literatures and methodologies. So reading groups on time and care, for example, have brought me into conversation with bodies of work usually outside the range of the type of interdisciplinary reading that might be typical in a history centre. So there's been new strands of feminist philosophy, psychosocial literatures, queer, crip and critical theoretical work, as well as ethnographic and literary methodologies. Equally, workshops, conferences and research days have introduced whole new interdisciplinary fields around waiting and temporality, as well as on tangentially related subjects. Of course, I don't claim to have a handle on them all, or in fact on many of them, but through this exchange, I've incorporated frameworks and concepts now central to my historical research. So if I might do a plug for those interested, there's a lunch tomorrow with the Welfare Studies Group to discuss some work that Gareth and I have been doing on social democratic welfare, thinking how we can historicise it as productive of temporal architectures. And in that sort of concept and that work, we're drawing on work by Sarah Sharma on sort of social and cultural theories of temporality and power, as well as on feminist thinking around care by scholars like Maria Puig de la Bellacasa. And secondly, and perhaps more enduringly, this work has also eroded my early scepticism about certain methodologies and forms of interpretive, speculative and normative knowledge bases. So I should say, by way of caveat, like all disciplines, history has always drawn from other disciplines for core concepts and interpretive frameworks, as well as many of its methodological innovations. Equally, my MA and PhD training was in a Wellcome-funded Centre for Medical History at the University of Warwick. In fact, your previous speaker, Roberta Bivens, was my supervisor. And as we can see, the history of medicine, we could see that as being its own interdiscipline in a way. It's got a rich history of drawing on anthropology, sociology, philosophy and the arts, among other disciplinary formations. And to some extent, we can see the influence of this as on my PhD research and the book that came out of that, which examined how the chronic management of diabetes was bound up with projects for managing professional autonomy and labour within the 20th century health services. So here I drew on political, scientific and sociological theories of professionalism, as well as historical philosophies of discipline as part of an intellectual framework. But I would suggest, with the sort of benefit of space and a bit of time, that this was also a very particular form of engagement. The sorts of works I read were often quite familiar to historians, and my readings often adopted a kind of critical stance towards them as a form of defensiveness. I used critique of these works' historical narratives in an effort to historicise their origins to maintain some form of intellectual distance from them. Work in the centre and on the Waiting Times project, though, has generated, I think, a more open engagement with a broader set of fields and has made me, in that sense, a better collaborator. I still maintain a historical orientation to knowledge production, but I'm also not looking to use critique as a form of crutch, if you like. Instead, I'm looking to engage in different disciplinary fields on their own terms, and more carefully consider how they might be integrated into forms of historical analysis. Moreover, these experiences have underlined the benefits of not only collaborative working, but also fostering forms of cross-disciplinary peer review, unstructured dialogic spaces, and other forms of steering group to guide and research and foster interaction. This doesn't mean that equivalent processes internal to disciplines need to be scrapped. But whereas these disciplinary structures, might ensure important collaboration to developments within the field and literatures closer to home, engaging in interdisciplinary settings can help broaden our range of analytic tools and reference points, and for some have even transformed conceptions of what rigor might look like. There are, of course, a host of other potential personal and professional benefits to interdisciplinary working. New sources of funding, new outlets and audiences for our work, among many, but also a sort of affective pleasures that derive from creating new networks or being on the ground floor, if you like, of new interdisciplines in formation. Interdisciplinary work can also fundamentally, I think, shift our understandings of ourselves and our relations to others. And the sort of content that we're now about to encounter in the talk is really a testament, I think, to how psychosocial literatures have attuned me to questions of time and affect, which I'll get onto. But rather than kind of recapitulate much of what is in the literature, I'll instead turn to how engaging with other scholars across disciplinary boundaries has its risks and challenges. In particular, following Callard and Fitzgerald, I'll focus on the affective difficulties that can arise from moving beyond epistemic, institutional, and disciplinary boundaries to which and centres to which one might have become accustomed, and to hone in particularly on what Aguiar calls the quote anxieties of interdisciplinarity. So, though disciplines are Is that okay? Oh no, okay. User error, as always. Yeah. Yeah. I think many people are probably thinking that would be good if we didn't have to hear them for the next half an hour, but there we go. Though disciplines are fuzzy, internally divided and dynamic, they nonetheless provide powerful sources of socialization and identity. Every discipline, Simon Schaffer has noted, tells a story, where it comes from, where it is going. It provides a rationale and a means for the pursuit of a disciplinary enterprise. So disciplines are performative. They help make what they purport to merely announce. So through our training, we not only become inducted into certain modes of practice and comportment, but also into these disciplinary narratives. Oh, it's working too well, if anything. Okay. On the one hand, then, for some scholars, moving into interdisciplinary structures can mean risking the status and resources that might come with particular identities, even as Aguiar points out, making them vulnerable to cost-cutting schemes. On the other, moving into interdisciplinary arenas, even those occupied by other Haas scholars, can mean losing those loosely shared reference points that monodisciplinary spaces might foster. However, it is not only this unmooring that can be anxiety-filling. For individuals, so can the prospect of intellectual exposure. So, for example, one especially productive strategy that we had on waiting times for sort of holding together the work was the use of twice-termly research days. Now, these days are loosely structured around research updates from each member, forward planning for events and publications, and large periods set aside for discussion of particular issues or readings. For at least the first year of the project, I experienced the run-up to and participation in these research days as a mixture of excited anticipation as to what new ideas might emerge. Thanks. Pleasure at the opportunity to connect socially with colleagues who became friends, and a sense of dread. This dread related to the epistemic and social challenges of interdisciplinary collaboration, whether that's failing to understand references that someone might make to an author or a field, misinterpreting a concept or perspective from another discipline, saying something which wasn't translatable across different fields, or something that was just plain wrong. Sometimes I might say nothing for whole meetings so as not to risk embarrassing myself, only then to feel guilty and that this silence reflected somehow a lack of value to the project and to the collective. Worse, knowing the difficulties of the job market, at times I even thought maybe I've taken a spot from somebody else that might have been more deserving or more beneficial to the team. So it's an imposter syndrome fed on an unhealthy diet of interdisciplinary crosstalk. Now I should clarify that my colleagues on the team never did anything to provoke these feelings. There was no mockery or criticism, and in fact, meetings were wholly supportive. The PIs have constantly praised my contribution to the project. Equally, I think it's worth reiterating that nothing ventured, nothing gained. The flip side of the risk of exposure is often reward, both in terms of new ways of thinking and working, as well as collegiality, friendship, and developing opportunities. But I guess what I want to stress is that leaving behind the familiar can provoke feelings of unease, anxiety, and questions of self-esteem nonetheless. And these feelings do not always go away. Every interdisciplinary collaboration or event can stir them up. But invoking a theme that I'll return to, time does allow you to become accustomed to them and to develop both new traditions of practice and a sense of familiar ease amongst the people that you're working with. Having discussions in the Welcome Centre has also underlined how common these feelings can be. Whether in seminars, in reading groups, internal presentations, away days, workshops, writing groups, grant writing meetings, or even a conversation in the kitchen, the opportunity for this intellectual exposure arises. And of course, I think gradations of seniority and longer careers within these spaces can provide a degree of protection, but I think the risks exist for everybody. And simply knowing that these feelings are shared, rather than just trying to resolve them, can help make them more manageable. Yet in a setting like the centre, where multiple research projects coexist and interact, but they aren't often managed as a collective, different anxieties of interdisciplinarity can also be produced, and often in relation to time. So the different speeds and timelines of academic work can be one prominent source of angst, particularly in relation to postgraduate research. So though institutes like the Welcome Centre are dedicated to supporting whole cohorts of interdisciplinary PhDs, doctoral candidates are still often placed in home discipline for funding, supervision, and assessment. This means that the structure, expectations, and timescales for doctoral work can be radically different. Within social science and anthropological traditions, for instance, doctoral candidates might take a year for a literature review, they might have another year for field work, and then another year also for writing up. Other traditions, by contrast, might have different trajectories. It's not uncommon for historians to get straight into archival research, for instance, and then alternate between primary source reading and writing as they go. The differential speeds that then result around presenting or publishing new research can produce an impression within early career scholars that some are ahead and others are behind. And with this feeling can arise feelings of envy or anxiety about one's own capacity. These can in turn create a situation where writing or research becomes stuck, or where people feel unable to share their work and then become cut off from the very benefits of interdisciplinary collaboration that exist. Now, there are, I'd suggest, no easy solutions to these situations, which are often bound up with a whole host of other issues. In the centre, we're trialling discussion sessions and research culture events to make visible different expectations and what we might call, quote unquote, the hidden curriculum. We hope that efforts to demystify certain processes and the capacity to talk through the affects of interdisciplinarity can help address the issues raised. But there is, of course, no silver bullet. I think in this respect, then, we can begin to tease out some of the differences in the challenges of a distinct grant like waiting times and working as a part of a more loosely bounded centre like the the Welcome Centre. Whereas waiting times encapsulates different strands and projects of research, that shared object and goal of work are more tightly focused. Research collaboration is more structured, and not just through regular research meetings and reading groups, but also through joint writing exercises, conference papers and events, and outputs that are envisioned as a core part of the enterprise. Labour for organising these collaborations are also more clearly demarcated and shared. The PIs, for instance, or the principal investigators, do a lot of the conceptual drawing together. And in conjunction with our wonderful project manager, they also undertake much of the organisational heavy lifting. That is, they create an encouraging and supportive environments, they foster shared work and thinking, and negotiate schedules for producing outputs, but they are also consciously driving the collaboration on which the project is founded. The centre, by contrast, is more diffuse and organic, and so is its purpose. Its purpose is there to provide an environment in which collaboration and interdisciplinary work can emerge, often from the bottom up. And at times, of course, this can create its own labour and affective labour and logistical problems, especially when not all members of the centre are employed in the same manner. So whereas the research fellows, doctoral candidates, professional services staff might be on fixed-term contracts, often of short duration, more senior members generally have permanent posts, but along with the security comes a whole host of hidden responsibilities within their own departments. On the one hand, this can mean that finding suitable times for whole centre events is incredibly difficult. Different timetables and labour commitments work against the sharing of time. Situations even arise where certain people miss events regularly, events that they might want to attend, such as seminars, because the best time for the most people is not the best time for everybody. You can't suit everybody in the same way. On the other, the greater day-to-day temporal freedom of junior staff mean that they undertake much of the organisational and research culture work with support from senior figures where possible. And in many respects, this is expected and unproblematic. Organising events is often an important part of an informal training and networking, and it provides opportunities to meet colleagues and to set intellectual agendas. But this work can also be boring and laborious. It can feel invisible, and it can eat into scarce time on precarious contracts. From my own experience, organising seminars and internal discussion sessions, the clock can feel heavy. You're aware that the work that you're doing, bringing people together, is essential, and even in the planning and even during events themselves, you can often feel immense pride at being involved and having sort of pulled off some really great discussions. Nonetheless, the week can also feel like it shrinks, and work on what is often institutionally valued, namely publications and grant proposals, which are central to job security, feel like it gets constantly interrupted. And in part, I think this is where we can see those contradictions and demands of neoliberal higher education pulling through. On the one hand, as we've noted, demands for interdisciplinary collaboration have aligned in certain ways with neoliberal imperatives for innovation and grant capture. But on the other, reforms to higher education have produced ever-growing workloads, reduced availability of secure contracts, and squeezed departmental budgets. And all of this works against the time that's required for interdisciplinary collaboration to take place. So for permanent staff, even with research time, buyout, time can get consumed by teaching preparation, marking, pastoral care, citizenship roles, all of which are purposefully undervalued in workload planning in order to meet very tight budgets. This is compounded by bureaucratized assessment and training that often accompanies neoliberal accountability processes. For junior staff, precarious and fixed-term working often becomes the norm for postdoctoral work, and for interdisciplinary work in particular. As a result, for institutions, creating a consistent and inclusive research culture can become more difficult, because the people that you're often relying upon to establish and maintain working norms also face a constant churn in and out of jobs. And for individuals, the anxiety of not knowing where your next contract is coming from can take a heavy toll. I've had several acute panic attacks in the past with uncomfortable hours in A&E, and I know that mental health issues are a growing problem within neoliberal academies. So to reflect then, I think my take-home message, if you like, on what it takes to do interdisciplinary working circulates around two interrelated themes, emotion and time. Firstly, doing interdisciplinary work will create complex affective landscapes, and functioning effectively requires a certain amount of emotional labour. For Callard and Fitzgerald, forms of what they call emotional regulation often relate to jealousies, tensions, and frustrations that can arise within interdisciplinary groups. Some scholars have promoted what they call frank discussions and particular working protocols to regulate these conflicts. However, Callard and Fitzgerald instead suggest something more radical, and they suggest that often work can only proceed because complex affects are not consistently shared and escalated into conflict. Moreover, they note that these irritations and fits of envy might be more prominent where asymmetries of power, resource, and epistemic prestige are most acute. Yet, as they suggest, such inequalities are unlikely to change, whatever processes or agreements are put in place. So they instead ask, to quote, what if we just accepted, in the most basic sense, that if you're a humanities and social science person in an interdisciplinary project, then there is some likelihood you're going to have to meet your interlocutors more than halfway, that the emotional labour of holding things together might well fall substantially to you, and that there's a good chance you're going to have to take responsibility for much of the project housework. What if, as a natural science person, you made peace with the fact that your collaborators will assume you've never thought through your field's problematic use of particular terms, that they will sometimes treat you as a veil of rigour, granting them access to various pots of money, and then expect you, as one of the few scientists who have bothered to attend interdisciplinary meetings, to consistently rep your discipline. And they suggest that in doing so, actually, some very interesting work can result. I think, however, there are other forms of emotional regulation that can usually take on institutional life. That is, providing time and technologies for acknowledging the conflicting emotional states produced in interdisciplinary sites. Even just offering space to acknowledge and explore how negative feelings can arise from numerous sources, such as contrasting research trajectories, differential labour distributions, and epistemic exposure, can provide a meaningful way for scholars to feel heard and not alone in their struggles. I'd say this is less frank talking and more open dialogue. The second take-home reflection is that time is central to doing effective interdisciplinary collaboration in various ways. So whether that's a discrete project or more loosely structured research centre, collaboration is only likely to arise once enough time has passed together to generate a sense of safety and predictability. So once you get to know your colleagues' interests, their character and temperament, and equally, if an aim of interdisciplinary collaboration is to achieve some form of epistemic transfer or even transformation in thinking of fields, then this form of exchange also requires time. This is not simply about clock time and duration, though there are forms of collaboration that will require years or even a decade or more to realise their goals. New centres and institutes require time to develop protocols and working cultures, to hire staff and bed in new teams, let alone to undertake the research, publish and engage in more experimental forms of work. Rather, I want to suggest what is also essential is having synchronized time together as colleagues and collaborators, whether that's in reading groups or in seminars, in workshops or research days. This form of temporal suspension provides opportunity to talk effectively through shared interests and emerging projects. And now, from my perspective, this has been most useful when it's been undertaken in a form of regularity and repetition, so maybe a reading group that runs every 2 weeks over a term that provides a kind of intensity of contact. But this sort of form of temporal synchronization can also have different forms. It might be perhaps intense training camps around certain issues, or showcases of research with planned follow-up meetings. This is not, I should stress, an appeal for quote-unquote slow research. There are often compelling reasons, for instance, for having rapid response functions to interdisciplinary work, whether that's news cycles, short-term funding calls, or pandemics. Equally, where collaborative writing is involved, a short but intense writing retreat, for instance, can be more effective than a long-term 1-hour meeting every week on a drawn-out timescale. I think we should also heed colonial histories of demands to wait and to move slowly. So slowness, that is, can sometimes be an obstacle to social justice and necessary reform. However, I would suggest that rapid work is likely to function best where relationships and trusts have had time to develop. So where there's an existing platform being constructed to enable swift processes of exchange and collaboration to take place. Equally, I would add that the relationships on which effective interdisciplinary collaborations are built also do not just happen. Even in my short career, I can remember spatial reorganizations of buildings designed to co-locate disciplines such as history and sociology with the intention that collaboration would be strengthened. And often that was without success. Similarly, even in research centers, kind of co-locating with colleagues does not inherently produce interaction. And indeed, we can see the growing use of digital platforms over the coronavirus pandemic. Those platforms I'm familiar with, like Teams and Zoom, have underlined this. So on the one hand, interdisciplinary collaboration and temporal synchronization is increasingly taking place online over different distances. But this can also mean that by sharing space together, you're also not necessarily sharing time. So there have been instances where I've gone to speak to colleagues only to realize that they're on a Zoom call or a team call all morning. And such online collaboration, I think, has even challenged our original spatial design. There's this picture at the bottom, which was built around shared and open plan spaces. But if you're if you're having to have a call, headphones can sort of mute some of the sound coming out, but it doesn't mute that going in. So we've had to develop new working cultures and norms to adjust to those new developments and the ways that collaboration can take place. So it therefore requires careful management to be effective, whether that's from project leads or members of a centre. Responsibilities for organisation needs to be clearly allocated and valued, whilst the form of such events and shared times, whether that's reading group seminars or workshops, should also be derived from consultation with a broader research community to foster buy-in. And finally, I think it's also worth underlining the importance of professional services staff to making anything function. It is their labour which is often most invisible and which is directed to creating forms of academic time, avoiding scheduling conflicts, ensuring timely marketing, organising finances, materials, people and events, without which academic work is impossible. And so their time too needs protecting, both in terms of secure contracts and in terms of their day-to-day labour. So with that and my apparent inability to use a microphone, I'm going to have that as a nice place to end. I know this isn't exactly necessarily what was advertised, but I do hope there's been something of interest there. So thank you so much for your time, and I think we've all earned a sort of short break, and look forward to discussion once we come back. So thank you.
Yes. Are we on? Are we on? Yes. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thanks.
I don't think we've got time for a short break.
No, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, let's run through.
But we might go through some questions now, and there'll be a chance to have a chat over a sandwich upstairs, and the fellows will also have a chance to grill you even more. But with that in mind, are there any immediate questions? Anybody that wants to ask anything? Klaus, would you like a microphone?
Look at this weird voice as well. Is it on?
Yeah, you should be.
Okay, thank you, Martin, for your presentation. It sounds like a Talking Heads concert in the 1970s. But so, I mean, tons of things that can be discussed and so on. So I was like, I have like a more general question and a specific one. So one of them is, I mean, I think that's also what I hear you saying. There's two ways. So there's one way, it's driven by funding decisions. So you put out a pool of money and then people will go for the money. And that's a way of securing that you will have interdisciplinary projects. And then there's a kind of the more bottom-up where people kind of invest time together and then develop the project afterwards, which is, of course, we say with the time thing, I mean, two different worlds. So, But I think that there might be a third element in this. So which and you touched a little bit on it, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. So the point is that careers are still, at least in the universities in Denmark, I know, and I guess to a large degree also in Britain, based on disciplines and institutions, the classical institutions, whereas the research centers often do not offer, like you say, a permanent work contract, I mean, with a tenure track possibility and so on and so forth. So in my head, that kind of results in people thinking about interdisciplinary as a step on the way to leaving it again.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know if you have any reflections on what kind of work. I would say either it's that or the luxury of people who are tenured, and I think it could be interesting to look in other places. So how does this career thing work? I mean, for instance, based on your experience. So that's my first question. Okay. The other one is more specific on humanities. It seems to me that humanities might be the field most keen on joining interdisciplinary work, probably for very good reasons. I mean, humanities is generally under pressure in many places. I mean, bad press, funding, I mean, not as good as it should be, so on. So, I mean, how does it look from a humanities perspective and meeting other disciplines where, I mean, the need for this might be less, or the need might be driven by something else, that the funding possibility and I mean, securing that you have legitimacy in the funding landscape and so on. I mean, isn't there a special humanities angle to this? And do you think we're good at handling that? I mean, I'm not always sure because, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, big questions. If I take the last one first, if that's okay. Yes, I think there is a. I think in a way that's kind of where medical humanities kind of emerged from in one instance, was the sort of notion that there is a way in which we can frame impact in a way in terms of kind of sorry. Should I take would that one have less feedback?
Yeah,
do you think?
It might work a bit better. I don't know how you turn that off. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yes. So I think there is, and I think also sort of social sciences. If you're going to break down the HAS kind of the boundaries, I think the social sciences in particular have a longer history of kind of doing that sort of outside of HAS collaboration. So I think you're right that there is a particular politics to the way that the sort of humanities might approach this. Whether we do it well, I think probably not speaking as a collective. I know that there are individual projects that I think do that very well. And I think people are making a career, and I suppose to link to that sort of the first question you asked, people are making a career out of being able to move across those sort of disciplinary spaces because they've got that track success in kind of making it work. I think just thinking in terms of my own experience, there's not exactly, a lot of that is still kind of within the art. It's not something which is kind of taught or trained, like you kind of learn by doing on the job. And I think we can sort of discuss whether that's of benefit or not, actually. I think that kind of, in some ways, it produces a kind of flexibility and a skill set which can be very valuable for individuals, but at the same time, unless you've got those kind of connections in, which we're not doing necessarily a lot of reflection on how we actually might be doing that better from a kind of humanities perspective. And I think actually because the arts often get missed out, I think the arts also have their own tradition of working particularly with scientists in terms of kind of science communication, and I think there's some really interesting stuff that's coming out of that. But I think bringing those together with the other humanities and social sciences disciplines can also kind of produce some very interesting changes in those dynamics. And I think there are different models for doing that work. I think that first question, you're completely right that the sort of the discipline is remaining as the way in kind of organising that sort of stuff. And I think for people coming in, there's also a kind of a double think that you kind of want to go in and engage in this interdisciplinary way, but you're also constantly thinking, how am I going to pitch myself? Because I need to pitch myself to a department after this to kind of to get work. And I think that there's ways that can work really well because you've got a breadth. If you're teaching in a department, you're going to be asked to teach on lots of different things. It's not just going to be your research specialty. So having that exposure to sort of different fields of knowledge, I think, is really useful. But at the same time, then you're also kind of thinking in terms of where you're publishing. For instance, it might be I need to target this specific disciplinary journal because that's the thing that's going to get me noticed within the people that I'm going to go on to talk to. So I think that's right. I think it also changes the way that people enter into that. The Felicity Callard and Des Fitzgerald, their book does suggest, and I think they're right, that some of that is changing in terms of the way that, for instance, teaching is shifting. I know in the UK that there are interdisciplinary modules and courses that are being offered. So there's a kind of move to try and have that as a kind of teaching angle. So I think that will potentially shift those kind of career structures. And I think also maybe someone from the US might have a different perspective. I think maybe that's sort of structured there, so that's kind of coming from a very particular kind of British angle. But hopefully, does that kind of get in there's a vague region of the questions here? Oh, sorry. You better keep the microphone. Okay. Well.
Yes, thank you for an exciting talk, and I think there's a lot that goes directly into DS. Some of the challenges that we are facing, you mentioned many of them here. One thing I was thinking about is this, that you talk about trust, and I can see, that is looking back on research projects, and so it takes a lot of time, and in particular when you come from different disciplines. And when I talk about trust here, it's not personal trust that can come very easy, but thinking about your field and in particular the language that you have to sort of align and become trustful in. Do you have any thoughts on that, on how to actually get the interdisciplinarity and not the multidisciplinarity?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, if I just speak from my own personal perspective, the things that I most valued, I think, going into particularly the Waiting Times project was these sort of crash courses in other disciplines. So, I did I think it might have only been like a 6-week thing on psychosocial theory. And again, as I say, I mean, I'm barely an amateur, but what I think it does is it kind of gives you a basis through which to both understand where that other person is coming from, and also a kind of the beginnings of a shared vocabulary that you might think about how those concepts have moved and might sort of apply across. And I think in order to maybe build trust, that's important for everybody on the project to do it, not just to expect the kind of, the stereotype is that it would be the social science people maybe going to do a crash course in neuroscience or something. But I think it's important that, and I don't think that's necessarily the way that it always works, but I think it's important for everybody involved from across those disciplines to do something like that, to make gestures towards willing to learn the kind of the language and the sort of the perspectives of the other people. And as you say, I don't think there's a shortcut to that. I think that just takes time. I mean, I think other people on the Waiting Times project might have a different perspective, but again, for me, it felt like a year until I was kind of able to sort of develop some of that shared vocabulary and really kind of get when someone was invoking a particular term, okay, that's kind of where it's coming from. So, yeah, so unfortunately, that's all I've got.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. It aligns so well with all the experiences that I have. I was sort of ticking off, yes, I agree. And then it brings me to the question, well, what do we then do about it? How do we go about this constructively? Because in my experience, articulating all the insights that you just did is not necessarily the best way of starting out a collaboration, because then we'll just be sitting, Brian is saying that because that is on his checklist for approaching me in a collaborative manner. He doesn't really think that way, but he doesn't really want to do so, but that is on his checklist, right? So establishing that trust sometimes requires you not to say those kinds of things. So any thoughts on where is articulation and what does that actually help or not or hinder in establishing interdisciplinary work?
Thanks. Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that it's what I keep going back to this book, partly because Des is a colleague of mine, but also because I think it's a great book that Felicity Callard and Des Fitzgerald wrote on interdisciplinarity, where they were saying precisely that sometimes you need to swallow things and also not kind of react in the moment, that sometimes there can be something that you see as being kind of a slight on your discipline or whatever, and that the best response isn't just to immediately say, well, this makes me feel like X, Y, and Z. And actually, there is a kind of question of needing to have that trust first before you can start sharing those things. Because if it's just somebody that you've just met 5 minutes ago and they're sort of telling you about how actually you feel that they're being overly critical or diminishing of the kind of the work, I think that's not the best foot to set out on. I think that's in part where some form of kind of offering a space that is contained, like a time that's contained for doing some of that sharing, so that it's not the whole time that you're not spending, you know, rather than doing the actual work that you're there to do, that you're spending the sort of the hours you've got together doing that. I think that there's a way in which you can, maybe through, you know, we've had kind of open research culture committees, for instance, where people have come and raised issues, and it might not necessarily be directed specifically to people. It might just be saying that, you know, actually I found that I know there were questions around accessibility in what we're doing that we might want to think about further. Not necessarily personalized, it's not necessarily kind of done kind of across the whole week, but there are sort of moments within that articulation can be worked out, and then it becomes a kind of something that you loop back to. So we've kind of got an action plan that we will then sort of run and see, okay, well actually are we addressing X, Y, and Z? What have we done to just kind of make sure that this is being met? And those processes aren't, you know, they have their flaws, but I think in some ways people knowing that that's a possibility and that that's going on, I think is kind of helpful for sort of managing some of that. But I think you're completely right. It's not just a case of like blurting out exactly how you're feeling at every moment.